everybody. As I said earlier on, my name is Natalia Palombo and I'm the Head of Programmes at ANN. And I'm going to be chairing the two panel conversations today. Thrilled to welcome 4 wonderful artists to the panel titled The Work Around the Work. Artists are often at the forefront of change, creating resources, leading campaigns and championing a fairer and more sustainable world. And this conversation will reflect on what it means to practice today, where activism sits within our practices, including some specific artist-led campaigns to consider why the responsibility is often placed on artists to reimagine and improve the conditions needed to sustain their work. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Jackie Tan, Soizig Carey, Tom Pope and Exodus Crooks. And I'm going to ask each artist today to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their practice in relation to the panel topic. So I'm going to pass over to Jack, first of all.
Hi, my name is Jackie Tan, and I am an artist that is working at the intersection of organizational development and art. But I trained as a ceramicist and with a legal background as well. So a lot of the ways in which I approach organizations is that I look at their rules from a legal point of view, but I also think they're basically a big massive pot or a big lump of clay that needs to be restructured aesthetically, basically. So yes, I'll look at your structures and yes, I'll look at your rules and your policies, but also a kind of synesthetic. I kind of get a sense of you as a blob or a kind of vessel that's got a crack in it, or it's got like a weird bit that needs working out, or that the materiality of you is a bit wrong and we might need to change it a bit. So there is a kind of legal analysis, but there's also material analysis. So a lot of the work I do is on that basis, and a lot of the work I do also is what I view as bureaucratic activism. So my background really, like my activist sensibility, comes from really like the 80s, really, when I, as a boy, we got caught up in the Brixton riots because Mum and Dad ran a market stall in Brixton Market, and I was there, and I just was thinking, what the hell is going on? And just the sense of that, and the explosion of that feeling. And so that kind of very visceral sense of a community under threat affecting my body as well, and my parents' livelihood. Then scroll on after law school, I ended up working with an organization that was doing Stephen Lawrence campaign, Zahid Mubarak campaign, Victoria Climbié. So a lot of like really high profile campaigns. And our work was really to shift the press, shift the stories, do the protests. And I think years, now like 30 years on after that, what I'm realizing is that really important to do that representational work and to make a stand, but for the work to last, we need to do the bureaucratic work underneath all that to create the structures of equity and the bureaucracies of equity as well. That has to be based on values of equity. So, and how we don't know what those are yet because we're so steeped in the values and the methodologies of neoliberalism. We need to invent the methodologies of equity, and then those need to seep into every boardroom, every decision making. Those rules, those new rules, need to inform how we do everything. So. Very briefly, the image you have in front of you is a project that I did with the Centre for Equity and Inclusion. That's part of the University of Sheffield, and I was approached to rewrite their partnership agreements because they work with a lot of community-based ethnic minority organizations, and they needed a partnership agreement between the university and the organizations. So I was brought in to rewrite the contracts, but working with each of the organizations. And of course, the first problem was legal language. Nobody understood the partnership agreement, so we had to rewrite it. So working with the organizations, we rewrite it, simplify the language to simple English. Then we came across the next problem, which was English itself. Working with African communities, Roma communities, Chinese communities, they all went, there's nothing in the English language that fully describes what we understand as partnership within our cultures. And because we just come from a different cosmology. And so in the end, what we thought, well, how can we create a contract that you can sign that also includes your cosmology? And so in the end, we thought we need to create visual contract. So these are kind of different clauses of contract, and they all represent a visualization of a concept that comes from their cosmology. I've got a copy of it here if you want to look at some point in time later on. I'll leave it here over lunch. And what you have is the legal term. This is the term for liability, and one of the groups said, well, liability for us means vulnerability, actually, not blame. It means that we are vulnerable to each other. And liability means, for our culture, to bare our heart to each other. And so the leading phrase, legal term is the image, and behind is a section of the interpretation of the image, and then the actual legal clause that would stand in front of a court if this went to litigation, basically. So the contract is made of three parts: the image, the interpretation, the legal text. If it went to dispute and it went to a county court, a judge could just go, what the hell is this nonsense? I will ignore that, but this still stands. And this still works. So it really is not saying, let's throw away the law. Let's just contextualize the law within our culture, within our worldview. And so really to kind of move away from that Enlightenment emphasis. So I'll just leave that here over lunch if you wanted to just browse through.
On to you, Soizig.
Hello, hi. Firstly, thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation. Feels like such an important discussion and one that we never, ever have enough space or time for. I'm going to refer to my phone a bit, so excuse me, it just helps keep my brain present. My name is Soizig Carey. I'm a cultural producer, curator and maker based in Glasgow. I work within and out with organisations and in between arts, craft, human rights and health. As an organiser, producer and curator, I'm especially interested in social equity, social histories, relationship building and creating opportunities for connection. Currently working with the Mental Health Foundation on an oral history project with refugee communities in Glasgow, where together we're exploring methods of recording and archiving intergenerational and intangible cultural heritage, what it means to document this heritage together and how it connects to our public and shared mental health. I previously worked for a long time in arts and cultural development with Scottish Refugee Council, where I programmed year-round work with artists and communities from refugee and other backgrounds, other migrant backgrounds. Feels maybe more relevant today to focus on that work and that background. Here, I worked really closely with artists and creatives and activists and community organisers over long periods of time, and it felt like there was such a need to move away from the more classic participatory short-term funded projects towards building in different kinds of infrastructure and support strategies and connections for artists, particularly who have been displaced, who are marginalised, and who live in extremely difficult systems. So we developed an arts and activism engagement programme, which was really tailored in response to the needs of artists who have been displaced. And we developed a mentoring programme, training, commissions and collaborations, which were around advocating for the rights, care and protection of artists and activists whilst facilitating artistic activity, connections and support. So this image here, which you can see, features commissioned artists, Paria Gudarzi and Francisco Linascasa on a 23-mile walk from Dungavel Detention Centre to the Home Office in Glasgow. This performative walk marked the 70th anniversary of the UN Refugee Convention back in 21, I believe. The whole walk was recorded, and we came back to this commission work several times, and they developed iterative work from that too, and we took that to arts organisations, and they performed that at Edinburgh International Festival as well. So through this work, this community building, we collated resources that might aid artists and activists too, which simultaneously had relevance for organisations working with artists, including Jack's amazing, easy-to-read artist contract. Thank you, Jack. Through all of this developed collective knowledge and community building processes, I really recognised and felt the need to develop a good practice resource, which became a mammoth beast. A resource for arts and organisations and artists with lived experience of displacement, co-authored with the brilliant Mia Goodbye, published last year. Where we meet, the unending thing that it is intended as a transformative resource that responds to systematic challenges in the creative industries and the needs and aspirations raised by artists over and over and over again, navigating them. It intends to offer guidance on fostering equity, navigating intersectional identities, and dismantling oppressive structures that disproportionately affect displaced artists. So it feels relevant to kind of talk more around that work. I suppose kind of what Jack talked about there, the infrastructure and the systems which get in the way and sort of hold and oppress, and you have to work your way around to do the kind of projects that you're funded to do. I felt like my practice, which is the kind of, fairly typical kind of arts organizer, producer, I became really a lot more interested in, actually how can we change or bend the infrastructures or make them more clear even to artists, especially and in kind of the field I'm working in, from who've experienced displacement. How can we bend these and map them out and also challenge them and question them and just help to make them more clear? So yeah, that's...
Thank you, Soizig.
Hello, I'm Tom Pope. So I'm an artist, traditionally trained or studied in photography, but now work with photography and performance. A lot of my practice stems from my working class background and attending a social club, and the dynamic of the social club. So looking at how, I guess, the working classes were suppressed by the middle upper classes through rational recreation due to the potential threat of urban radicalization of the working classes to overcome the upper middle classes in the mid 19th century. So, and then using play as a play, particularly from the social club, as a way to make those themes and those topics accessible to a wider audience. So almost all of my work exists as games, or using game structure, and that's like traditional pub games or social club games. So looking at structures around like snooker, dice, cards, and so that's kind of where my practice sits. I'm here, and this isn't an image of my artwork, but it is an image of some of the work I have done with other people. And for the last 3 years, or 3.5 years, I've sat on AN's Artist Council, which is, we will talk about in a bit, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it's a group of 15 artists spread across England that work with AN to help them be the artist advocate. With part of that work, for the last 2 years, I've worked with Alice Scott Hawkins and Melanie Wheeler, also both members of the Artist Council, and we've been working on the Green Manifesto, which should have been out on the table, so a lot of you might have it, and this is part of it, which is what's up here. So I'm gonna, I guess, a little bit later on in the conversation, I'll talk a bit about the work we've done to produce that over the last 2 years, where we are and where we would like it to go and how we'd like it to exist in the future. So, yeah.
I'm going to be a little bit, I'm going to keep it short, I think, because I'm still a little bit emotional and energized from Larry's talk. I'm not sure if anyone's still feeling it like in their stomach, but I'm still kind of there. So bear with me if I'm a bit slower. My name's Exodus Crooks. I'm a multidisciplinary artist and educator. I was going to like read bits of my bio and CV, but I actually think they are probably the most boring bits about me. Is my CV. And also you can just go online and, you know, do the typical stuff. And so I'm very briefly just going to share a little bit about how I sit in between states. I think perhaps that's what I'm bringing to this panel today. And maybe you just like me, Natalia. That's why you invited me. That could be the reason. Because I was sort of like, oh, I hope I fit into this panel in the same way that I feel like these guys do. But I think my practice is multidisciplinary. I sit between a lot of states of being, whether that's within my transness, my disability, you know, being a second generation Jamaican and sort of thinking about sitting between different identities, different spaces. And I look at, a lot of my work is introspective. So I'm thinking about what happens if we go slower, what happens if we look inwards, as individuals, but as community as well. And I kind of brand myself as, or pride myself on the idea of saying, I like to figure out how to have hard conversations softly. And so when I'm working with organizations, I work a lot in education as well, I'm figuring out how do we have these necessary conversations in a very polarized time, but we do it in a gentle way. And usually the answer is through art is the way to have those conversations. And so, yeah, I think my work is tangible and intangible. I imagine similar to everyone on this panel. Yes, I make pieces, but actually who I am and how I show up in every space I enter is a big part of my practice. Thinking about conflict resolution, thinking about how I connect with somebody else, not going into galleries and just having this transactional relationship of like, here's the artwork, here's my money, but actually building a genuine relationship. What's my love language, if you will? How do I date an institution before I get into a relationship with them? You know, which we've had some breakups over the years, and some people I'm still in love with, and you know, and AN's one of them. I think actually is like an organisation. Me and Julie, you know, but yeah, I'm on the council as well, like Tom. So we've been on the council for about 3.5 years, and really just thinking about how that works, how I work with other people on the council too, like making some really valuable connections and relationships, not just because we've been put together as a council, but because, I actually bond with that person. I actually really get along. So I suppose I'm coming today from a perspective of like intimacy and sort of like the more spiritual, emotional ways in which to work. Thank you.
think that is one of the many connections that's this, and I think I listen to the way you talk about how you have relationships with organisations, and I think probably resonates with all of us, but maybe not thinking about it in quite the same way. But I think, like we were talking today about the work that artists do around making work to build a sector that we can work within, and I've taken quite a practical approach to that, I suppose, and there's some really tangible resources, but I think what at the core of it is that commitment and the generosity and the gentleness that artists spend with organisations, really pulling them through to get to the place where you can make work together, and I think that is what this is about. Jack, I'm going to come to you first in terms of questions. On this panel, we'll talk about how artists and art workers create accountability within the sector and through artistic activist practices, resources and campaigns and many other means. And as a sector, we do often do this by focusing on good practice and process and equity through art making. And some of the challenges are the limitations of applying good and fair practice. So I think really interesting to hear everybody talk about their approach to work. And I know for a fact that there's challenges in having that applied in, within practice. And you've also spoken about your background in law and legal work, and I know that we all appreciate that knowledge and what that brings to the resources that you make. A big part of that is finding the ways to break down the legal aspect of contracts and collaboration through accessible language, and this often done visually, as you've already shown in that project. You've had a really interesting roles within organisations, often quite long-term engagements, or certainly like really getting into the nitty-gritty of how organisations work. So can you talk about your process of working with organisations and institutions and communities to develop work together? What's required to ensure the work is effective, and what have been the challenges but also the joys of that work? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think a really good segue in is the dating analogy, which is what I've done a workshop on how to draft artist contracts, and one of the things that I kind of say to people is the contract negotiation is basically dating. It's you kind of eyeing each other up, going, yeah, I like you, you like me, but this is what I'm like and this is what you're like, and let's pin that down, because that's all. It's actually really quite nice, the dating bit with an institution, until you get the contract. Then the contract's totally different from what you thought we had a relationship. It's like a slap in the face. Like, oh, this is what you really think we are, which is not what I thought we were. So it's like a prenup, basically. And I'm like, I'm not signing no prenup. This is what we... I thought we had a vibe. So the whole process is like, let's get to that vibe and write that down, not the prenup. So that's the process has been. So really, the process for me has been basically know who I am, find out what you are, clarify what you are. What I've learned is not to believe what they say they are, and to really see what they really mean, and then see if there's a contract we can sign together and work together. So that's really a lot of that process in working with institutions has been just clarification. So, and what I do in my collaboration writer is tell them right from the start, I'm like a high maintenance boyfriend. It's gonna take time before we actually, go into this relationship, and we just need to clear things up. So a lot of that, and the joys have been when we've both bothered to go through that process. Sometimes it might be a year before we start a project because we're just working things out. And the disappointments have been me not listening to the alarm bells and going into that relationship and then realizing it's not worked. And I think it's, like you say, it's really easy if it's like, if the work is simply, I've got a work here you just want to show it for this exhibition and I'll show it, or you want me to work with this community group for those hours and I'll do it. But unfortunately, the work that I want to do is non-linear, non-teleological, non-outcome oriented. I want to know how to do not knowing with an institution. I want to open up futurist imagination so that we can create a different world. So those things are really hard to pin down in a contract. So there is always the contract below the contract. And the work with institutions is, yes, getting the explicit agreement and then working on the unsaid contract as well below it and making that clear. And unfortunately, the contract below the contract isn't in words. It's in body language. It's in the look of the eye. It's in the vibe. It's in how your chemicals react to each other. And it's in the feel of a room. So those are actually as important as the legal rights. So I think if we get those right, then it's joyful.
Yeah. I was also I was thinking a little bit again how we share. So we're talking later on about collaboration, which is obviously across everything as well. But thinking a lot about how we share resources, and I suppose the work that you've been doing is really focused on the particular organisation or group or institution that you're working with. But I'm really interested in, I guess, your approach to sharing work with. I'm thinking specifically about the Easy Read contract that Soizig mentioned, that I'm sure lots of us have used, and not just I'll say from an organisational perspective in the past, not necessarily, not as an easy fix for actually this work, here's this thing that the work's already been done, but the process of then thinking through your own contracts or processes or ways of working with a team using the resource is really, really valuable. So yeah, I was interested in how important it is, I suppose, that the work that you do becomes open source, and I suppose maybe how, if there's challenges to that. I mean, I suppose a lot of organisations are not necessarily willing or able to share the work that way. But yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a wee bit about how to share resources and open source work.
The way that I feel able to share is if I kind of adopt a long-term strategy as opposed to short-term. So long-term strategy would be, because I want to achieve a world that is past my lifetime. So it's about trying to create ways of being with each other that go beyond me 100 years from now. And as an artist, I like to exist in that kind of dynamic of things emerging and things working together collaboratively. So I think to open source is to kind of show a kind of connection to other people's creativity, to how they might use your work in a different way, so that we can, because I can't do this alone. We've all got to do it together. I mean, that's not saying that I didn't have that neoliberal thought, which is, yeah, I'm going to copyright this contract, and then I'm going to put it behind a paywall. Anybody who wants to download it has to pay a fee, and then I'll update it version 1, version 2 every year to kind of increase the capital value of it. And then I thought, sure, I could do that, but then I'd be like this guy who runs a contract company and not an artist. I don't want to do that. So I think that really is like getting back to sharing as actually I think sharing is actually just the real, it's how the world is. The physical world and the actual world, just sharing is the default. Not sharing is something invented, not like quite recently, So I think it's like getting back to what all humans and more than human people originally are made to do, which is to share.
Soizig, I'm going to move on to you, and I was just wondering if maybe in the first instance, if you could talk a bit more about when I invited you onto the panel, I was thinking specifically about where we meet as a resource, and how valuable that's also been to my practice and lots of others as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more, just for people who might not be aware of the resource, what it is, the process of making it, how you chose who to work with, how you worked together, over how long, and how you worked with the artists to make sure that the resource was reflective.
It kind of came out of years of working in the arts and community development and listening a lot to artists and hearing about artists' experiences in the in-between conversations, and experiences that they've had with organisations, or not knowing the sort of wayfinding to for their practice. So it just sort of felt like it emerged as a necessary thing, as much as it's impossible to host all of that knowledge in the form of a guide, for want of a better word, in a document, as it is a tangible thing to be able to share, right, and to be able to share open source, to be able to hand to organisations, and a tool for artists to use as well. Artists who felt like, I've got a tiny, tiny voice. Like, who am I to question, anyone about working in the arts sector? I'm new here. I don't know how everything works. I'm developing my practice. I need work. I want work. But there are all these sort of tensions I'm experiencing, and maybe my voice is being used in ways which I did not consent to. And, I got this bit of work, but actually I've come away feeling really damaged by it, actually. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question there, but really the need just sort of emerged in that way. And through then sort of more formal conversations, through workshops, and through gatherings, and through one-to-one interviews with artists who wanted to be named, with artists who did not want to be named but wanted to share that. There was a process of kind of mapping out, okay, what are all of the threads here around, tokenism, around language, around money, around time, around advocacy, and what are the tensions here, and what are the ways that artists are actually working to kind of self-manage, and what's the language that they're developing around that. And so we really centred artists' voices in that sense. It had to come from that, and it took a really long time because there was a lot of process of dialogue, which is going back and forth, and doing that in a way which is not like, I've got that bit of, interview from you, and this is how we will quote you. It's like going back and forth constantly and doing it well, and like you can only do that if you have got a relationship, right? So it's the relationship building too. So yeah, it became that. It became something where we felt like there's a necessity for organisations in the sector, not just the arts, but like third sector as well, where kind of that work was sitting. Actually, there was a lot there that was really important to, and who I know organisations were like absolutely, salivating for, because they just were desperate to learn more and not say the wrong thing. And artists as well could then have this like tool, I suppose, to not necessarily have to say themselves, but say like, hey, look, there's this, advice here. And so that, it became huge. And then we ended up then making some summaries as well, where one summary was kind of more geared towards sort of organisations, but also like curators and independent practitioners too, and third sector, and then one for artists themselves, to be able to use about, just like supporting what you already know, actually, and like that you do have the knowledge, you do have the value, and you shouldn't have to always advocate for yourself on your own. So it's intended as that. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that's, a lot of the case with, with all resources, but the idea as well is, it's a lot of work to generate process and share process. But I suppose the idea is that it's meant to then create less work, and essentially artists are able to get on with making work.
Exactly.
But I guess it'll come up again and again. But I suppose some of the challenges being in implementing good practice and processes, and that's a whole other load of work. And there's probably, I'll ask kind of questions later about how we, continue to activate and use resources. On to Tom. Tom, you did mention the Artists' Council when you were talking, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Artists' Council and how it works and what you've been working on.
Yeah, sure. So, as I said before, the Artists' Council is about 15 artists based across England, and we're appointed by AN through applications and then interviews. And we sit outside of AN in a sense that we're a bunch of artists that come together about 4 times a year. And we then... I'm going to say lots of things that don't all necessarily sit, so just bear with me finding the right words. I think we're still trying to find the right words as a council on what we do for AN. But I'm going to say advise in some instance AN on their programming for that might help influence the direction of AN's programming to help best serve artists and for AN to be an artist advocate. That's like what you'd write down on the website if you read about AN. In real terms, it's a lot more messy. So when we set out 3.5 years ago, AN, from my experience, I'm going to represent the council here as well. Although Exeter is next to me, so you can chip in if you want. I think we were told not to produce anything. So no outcomes. Don't work on anything. Don't come up. You don't need to do anything. So you try and tell 15 artists to sit in a room together and not do anything is like the most difficult thing. So this is kind of where we started out as a council, and we really spent the first year getting to know each other and working out what we are, what our intention is, and what we value. And just through sitting in rooms, mostly Zoom rooms, and chatting, those things started to come to the surface. And we then kind of started to work. And this is like, it's not always like everyone makes this decision as a group. Some people have ideas that the group runs with. And at one point it was like, why don't we... It's very difficult for 15 people to be in a room and everyone have a meaningful conversation in 3 hours. So why don't we start working in smaller groups together? And so we decided to spend, so I guess going into our second year and into our third year for sure, we were, each meeting we would set out, or outside of the meetings we'd have these little subgroups, subcommittees in which we would just meet in a room, and it might be 3 or 4 people from the AC, Artists' Council, I'm going to call it AC going forwards, and we would chat. I think like the initial subcommittees were based around themes that had been coming out in conversations as a wider group, so around money, access, and a few others. And in those groups, in those subcommittees, and what we ended up doing, we would try and we would just kind of summarize, and it might be visually, it might be written. There was no structure and no prescribed structure in how we fed back to AN, but we would feed back, and this feedback would be like handed to AN via email, and it could be, as I said, it could be visual, it could be written, it could be just notes, it could be bullet points, but what that would do is give AN a sense of what the Artists' Council were thinking, and I guess through that, the Artists' Council being representative of the communities spread across the UK. And so we would be looking at the concerns directly in our communities, but then the concerns across the art sector across the UK from the perspective of artists in the trenches, so to speak. So artists on the ground at grassroots level. And I guess some of the going on to like resources, we did end up making stuff because you can't stop artists making stuff no matter how hard you try. We wanted to make stuff, and so we did end up, a number of the subcommittees ended up making and going on to work on more extensive projects. So one of them being, I've got to read this correctly, so the Guide to Enhance Accessibility within AN and the Artists Council itself. And this was a paper that explores how the Artists Council can work with AN, how the work that the Artists Council does, how it can be valued, how we can reduce barriers and promote effective communication when working together. I think this kind of is about, this goes beyond this work, although it's not published, is kind of internal. This paper could be an interesting resource for how artists work with organizations outside of AN. I think like what the group, I didn't sit on this subcommittee, but I've read the paper and I've listened in on conversations and feedback and draft papers of it. And I think it's a really amazing piece of work on trying to establish how artists work with organizations and the messiness that ensues when you do work together. Another piece of work, so with the subcommittees were then, was the artist advocate subgroups. So this is and this is kind of, we were doing this over the last year, and that was to look at how AN as an organization can best support artists, how the AC can be used better by AN. So the AC, being 15 artists, is an amazing resource in itself. And all the artists, like I can't get over like the idea of like being a part of this group of artists for the last 3.5 years, because the amount of knowledge in that room, the amount of experiences, the generosity of everyone in that room to share. It's been such a learning experience, and I'd never thought I would learn so much through not attending any lessons. It's like when we're not taught, there's no like, oh, we're gonna teach you this or you're gonna share this. It's just been through a conversation about money that Exodus and I had once, that like we come out of that going, oh yeah, that was a really valid point. And you start learning, and then these conversations, having that time and space to develop those conversations over a long time. One of the things I haven't mentioned that I should is that the AN pays the Artists Council, so we're paid to attend these meetings. So having that like up front, so we're paid to attend these meetings and chat about stuff, is like amazing, and it's not really something that happens in the arts so much. So it's a very valuable space and time to have. And so the last resource I'll talk about, and which is the one that I guess I'm on this panel for, is the Green Manifesto, and that was kind of set out literally 2 years ago to the date as a brief for to look at a grassroots approach to what environmental responsibility would be for an artist's practice, and through that, as I said before, so 3 people from the AC were shortlisted or picked to be on that subcommittee. So Alice Scott Hawkins, Melanie Wiener, and myself. And we spent then, I guess, how long did we spend? We spent like the first year researching, looking and speaking with artists, speaking with people in the sector around environmental responsibility, going to artist studios in our local communities, to see what artists are doing and what they need and what kind of support they need. And so it was the resource that has been built out of that is like, it started with a lot of research and with the Artists Council itself, and then it kind of narrowed down to forming this manifesto that's here today, which is kind of a 2-pronged approach. So it's a calls to action in which there are a number of points that we hope empower I don't want to say educate, but empower and share knowledge and inspire artists around working in a more sustainable or having a more sustainable approach to working. And then the second being a super practical resource, which just helps artists. So if I want to make my practice more sustainable, what can I do? And like, what's a really simple thing I can do? And so this resource, which is on the back of the manifesto, kind of is taken ideas from artists that they've shared with us, fully knowing that this would go into a shared resource, and it kind of becomes a knowledge exchange in a sense that as we gather more and more suggestions from people, then they will be added to the resource. So the resource will grow, and it's a free to access resource. So it's kind of this is a great like knowledge exchange for artists to share their practical ways of being more sustainable. And that was a really important part of what we needed the manifesto to be, and how artists would be able to work with that kind of resource. That I'm going to say, because I think I should as well. I think with today, there's like slips inside your manifesto. So if you took a manifesto today, there's a slip, and inside it does have like a call to action that like you're welcome to share the most simple thing or the most difficult thing or anything that you do to make your artistic practice or your creative practice more sustainable. And at the end of today, we'll go back and we'll add those to the resource. So this resource will keep growing. So even from this moment, this is the first time it's been in printed matter, it will start to grow and become bigger. And yeah, so please do take part and share your knowledge to share with all the other artists. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. I was going to ask about, because we spoke a wee bit, Tom, about the sort of challenge of, and I guess this came up as well in the panel in terms of that way of working that's often project focus or, particularly funded. I think with AN, there's a lot more longevity, and there is this sort of, there's an opportunity to work together over quite long periods of time. But we spoke about still the challenges of activating resources and continuing to activate them and make sure that they also change. And I think, this is a really interesting way of thinking about how it grows and moves with practice, and especially, we're learning constantly, and we need to keep kind of, pushing on in terms of how we understand a sustainable practice. And I wondered if you had other sort of thoughts in terms of how to continue to activate the resource.
These aren't shared with AN formally, or Julie. So I see Julie sat here watching me at the front, so I'm like, from the like, this is a conversation that hasn't happened in the last. I mean, I think this final draft of the manifesto came together probably a few months ago. Our first draft was finished by end of 2024, and then it went through focus groups, a peer review, and then here we are today. But these conversations around dissemination have been happening for the last 2 years. So from the beginning, because it's always been about how do artists engage with resources. I think one of the biggest, when I say I'm probably speaking from the we of the subcommittee team. I think like one of the biggest things has been around this idea of how the resource sits after it's been produced, and having resources sat on websites as PDFs is great, it's free to access, but really so many artists need and want the resource to be brought alive or activated, to say a really corporate awful term, I guess. And I think that needs to be thought about in how this is going forward. And I think this is just the beginning for the manifesto in that sense. And so we've come up with we're building up on, we're coming up with ideas around it, workshops, conversations, this sharing point is another element. And then even, I think our term finishes with the AC in February. Thank you, Exodus. In February, and so, yeah.
May.
Oh, May. Oh, there we are, May. And I think, I don't know yet, but I imagine there'll be another Artist Council after us. And I think one of those things, one of the most important things for us is that at the very beginning of the Artist Council, there should be an appointed Green Manifesto committee that can carry on, and we will hand a formal handover, and so they can continue this work, because like you said, this work isn't concrete. Just because it's printed here, it will change with time, it will change with what happens in society, it will change with the needs of artists. And so this work has to continue, and it has to be open to full change. So I think by handing it over in February, and then allowing other artists to come at it from their perspective, and then coming up with workshops that can help artists, even from like writing an environmental policy, which is a resource that we link to in this, but might come across as quite inaccessible or quite difficult to understand. But if you can workshop that and create a space for artists to share with each other, they can have an understanding of the similarities and differences in which we sit within, and that would help, I think, bring this to life. But also, for more importantly, it would help support artists in their practices to do what they mostly want to do. I think we are artists by our nature are quite sustainable. Yeah. I think this would just help them further do that.
Thank you. I've been thinking, I guess, throughout thinking around this panel and throughout the day about the artist as kind of activist, but also advocate or advisor to organisations and institutions, and also, I guess, this sort of sometimes this balancing of the work around the work, but also doing the work. But then in some ways, it's completely intertwined. It's as I was thinking about your practice in terms of, you talk about education, and you've spoken about education as being rooted in care and empathy, community and connection, which I really loved. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about this in detail, and particularly, I suppose, and I'm thinking as well about Larry's speech as well, but particularly about the potential for kind of social and political change and justice through education and art making.
I think education is less of like this hierarchy of disseminating knowledge and someone like telling you something, but it's this exchange. It happens in spaces where it's beyond the classroom, and actually it's something. So I did this isn't a plug for BCU, by the way, but I did an MA at BCU many years ago called Arts and Education, led by the incredible Kathy Wade, who's here. And I'm not. Kathy's not paying me to promote for this course, by the way, yet. But the course actually taught me everything outside of formal education, and so education happening at the bus stop with a stranger, and just an elderly woman telling me about her life or whatever, in a barbershop or a salon where you're getting your hair done, and like the things, education beyond the traditional Western classroom of just, someone's talking at you and putting information into your head. And so when you speak a bit about this social and political impact, I think for me, my approach to education has been really about turning that completely upside down. Because I think and I can only speak about English schools, and those of you in the audience who are here from different European countries. So the IAA, I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but the IAA, we've actually got, so we met yesterday at General Assembly. We've got a bunch of different people in here from lots of different countries. You've probably heard some people speak already or met them, but yeah, we've got people from Sweden, Norway, Finland, a bunch of people here, who's really cool. But what a lot of I'm speaking about, or I'll mention today, will be specifically about the English system, because it might work very differently to how it is in your countries. And I'm excited to hear actually how that differs a bit later over lunch. But my experience of the English education system is that currently there's this pipeline from sort of the classroom to a corporate world, or in some cases the classroom to the prison line, where you are taught and encouraged simply to obey. A lot of kids in schools right now, especially in secondary school, you are just trained to obey and listen, and even uniform and all these different things, like the way you walk to classroom, the way you listen, and you can't do this and you can't speak that way. And as far as even how you have your hair and how you express yourself. It's like, no, do not express yourself. Everyone needs to be. And I get some of the pros to having uniform, but for the most part, a lot of it is just preparing and grooming kids to be able to sit and obey a manager and to be sort of like passive and obedient. And so it's training them out of having a voice. And that is why a lot of the time in classrooms, neurodivergent people, people that are just different from what they deem to be the norm, and children that want to express themselves and push back. I had a big thing in when I was teaching formally at the last college I worked at. I had a very small rule, small but quite powerful, in that I told my students who were A-level, so A-level and foundation, 16 to my oldest student was like 21. I told them, don't ask me to go to the toilet. It sounds really small, but the fact that we've got young people asking permission to relieve themselves is really quite, when you think about it, it's very oppressive. And so, I was like, don't ask me. Something as small as saying, for fire safety purposes, I'd say, just let me know you're leaving the room. And that small switch changed the idea of autonomy over ourselves. And even certain things like telling my students, if they disagree with me, tell me. If you're angry with me, if I upset you, tell me. And it did cause some problems because other teachers didn't want to practice it that way. And so when a student told me, actually, Exodus, like, the way you spoke to me yesterday was a bit harsh. And I was like, you're right, I'm sorry. And that was really important. But then telling that to another teacher, they got put in detention, because they're seen as being disrespectful, which is disrespectful, I think, and maybe it's a very British thing, but this idea of politeness can be so violent in the way we use it. This idea of like, you must say a thing a certain way, don't say this, don't say no, which I think is a massive problem too. And then we wonder why so many young people are being groomed or abused. And it's because in the classroom, you're telling them you're supposed to respect every adult, and that's rubbish. Adults, as we know, can be very problematic and not safe spaces. So by encouraging young people not to say no or not to challenge that, it's really quite dangerous. And so I think my educational practice is very political in that it's teaching young people have that voice, push back, take control of your space. I did an activity a couple of years ago as part of a project where it was about climate change. And the project was basically to ask these 15-year-olds, how would you fix the environment? What's your anxieties around climate change? And the first thing most of the class said to me was like, they just kind of shrugged and was like, we don't care. And at first I was like, what do you mean you don't care? Like, it's your future and blah, blah, blah. But actually what they were saying is, we don't have a say about anything. And now you're asking us to talk about the environment. We don't get to choose what time we start school. We don't get to choose what we have for lunch. Ultimately, they get burger or this, and that's their only option. They don't get to choose how even their classroom is set up, where they get to sit. So you're asking 16-year-olds who have no choice in everyday life, then to vote, then to talk about climate change. It doesn't make sense. So my thing was like, the first thing we're going to do is rearrange the classroom. And honestly, the teacher was stood there like shaking and tense and anxious, like, oh, they're going to break something. Like, she was stressed. Like, I had to sort of say to her, it's okay, And the students were more confused. They were like, what do you mean I get to pick where my chair goes? And it was quite heartbreaking, actually. Like, just the choice of getting them to rearrange the classroom was really, really quite difficult for them. But when they did, you saw a really interesting thing happen of like taking control of their own space. We had some students who put their desk towards the window, so their back was towards the teacher, which the teacher was like, we can't do that. But they were like incredible once they did that, and what they said was, at home, their desk in their bedroom faces the window. And so they wanted it to reflect that space. And so I say all this just to say, like, this idea of, artists making change and artists within education, I think we're there to disrupt education, and we need to disrupt education. And any opportunity you get as a creative to be in academia, disrupt that. Because right now, government is not there saying, like, do it this way, do it that way. They're taking the arts out of schools. They're discouraging any sense of voice. And if you do speak up for yourself, you're being told you're being disrespectful or naughty or bad, and you're labelled these things. And what it's actually doing is simply shutting down a lot of young people. I'm not even sure if I answered the question there. Sorry, Natalia.
It is, but yeah.
I just went off on a tangent.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, it's also just really exciting to think about a different way of learning. Again, Larry and I were talking yesterday, and keep coming back to, the importance of education, but of giving young people autonomy and power and confidence. And it's exciting to think about, that way of learning, but also really scary to think about how far we are from embedding it. And like you say, like how that disrupts the kind of the norm and the normal way of the education system kind of sits within. But then, how do we? I don't want to ask you this question, but how do we create change across a much broader sense?
And this is a question that even the asking of the question is the start, and it's a question I'm trying to answer constantly within my practice. My artistic practice and my educational practice blends together quite beautifully and is always sort of in dialogue. And I think one of the things I say to a lot of educators is that they should also be in the position of being a student, if possible. That doesn't mean going into formal education, but I think it's really important that every teacher should also be a student in some form, because otherwise you can't empathise with your students, and you're going in and you're the teacher and you're above here and what I say goes, and it's really quite, it's imperialist even in its structure, and education is very colonial in the way it works, specifically here. And so I think one of the first steps is recognising who you are. I guess it's that introspection I talk about. Who are you? What are your issues? How did you used to learn when you were younger? Have you got any hang-ups about learning? Are you still carrying a lot of burdens? I worked for a school in Birmingham many years ago, and the head teacher was the biggest bully I've ever seen. And I realised later on, we found out on a drunken night out, a Christmas party, that he was bullied in school, and he never got past that. And so becoming a head teacher was actually his way of and it was really quite problematic, recognizing that you'll be surprised, maybe you're not surprised, but a lot of teachers hate kids. They hate students. And I'm like, there's other jobs out there, like you can do another job, And so it was really problematic to see how much teachers hated kids, but were in that role as a power play or had their own issues. And so for me, I thought it was really important that, for one, if I'm going to educate, if I'm going to disrupt, I need to be in some form of therapy, for one, to which I recommend to everybody. But two, recognizing my own issues, my own hang-ups, my own biases, my own privileges, and then from there sort of asking that question, the same question you've asked, how do we do that? How do we disrupt? And I think the first thing is looking at questioning things. I think we get into a really complacent way. And I have to say, even for myself, I grew up in a very religious structure. And so a big part of the religion I grew up in was to simply follow, like obediently, just blindly follow. And so my first step in disrupting was going, hold on, questioning everything I had been told over those years, and ironically told not to question it, and so, which is usually how these oppressive things work. But questioning, pushing back on it, why do we have to do it that way? Even small things, that some things you'll question it and find it works that way, but even down to the structure of this very room, we're sat here. Why? Why does it need to be in this position? Why does that need to be there? And the answers might be so that we can all get water, great, okay, so that we can see each other. But but this is what I mean, just questioning every usual structure that we go along with, that we think about, even in terms of access. What's brilliant today is, we're all talking and we've got this screen here, which I think is fantastic. And most things I've been to, they haven't thought about those things, a translator or sort of having captions. And I think it's questioning everything. And I also think it's planning lessons or sessions to the most marginalized person in the room. Whereas usually teachers and educators, they plan it to like the average student. And whatever that looks like is a student that can read English or speak. Whereas for me, I'm like, okay, I need to plan a lesson that the most disabled, if that's even possible, the most disabled, the student who English is a second language for them, the student who is usually forgotten about, the student who, is considered ill-behaved. My lesson is aimed at them, because actually once I aim it at them, everybody else learns well too, as opposed to the other way around. Access is at the center. The young person or even an adult that is the most marginalized and oppressed, creating my lesson towards them. It's similar to ramps. I always say this, but if everywhere was a ramp, everybody could travel up a ramp. but instead we do stairs and then we do a ramp as the extra thing. And then, so the person who can't do stairs or is in a wheelchair of some form, they're now looking around for that one ramp. But all of us who can actually use our legs in that way can still walk on the ramp. And so why isn't everywhere just got ramps instead of stairs? And so it's just kind of flipping that perspective of how we think about people, how we think about access, how we think about what is normal.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll end there, and I know there are a few other questions, but we've got an hour and a half for lunch so that people can shake their shoulders and whatnot and have a chat. So please do. There's also, as Marianne said, there's exhibitions here at the Bluecoat, and they're really fantastic. So take the time as well to see the exhibitions, and we'll be back here at 2:15. Thanks. Okay, thank you. And thank you to the panel.